going to turn it over to Natalie Friendberg. She is the education coordinator with the Oxbow Eco Center, who put this series together, and she's going to kick us off.
Well, welcome. My name is Natalie Friendberg, and like Sandy said, I work at the Oxbow Eco Center for the St. Lucie Environmental Resources Department. Welcome back, and thank you all for joining us today for the Resilient St. Lucie webinar series. Today is part 2, Climate Change Cascading Impacts. Just to go over a little bit of housekeeping for today. Unless you're a speaker, you'll automatically be muted. Our tech support, Amanda Thompson, will be unmuting speakers as needed. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be made available at oxboweco.com on our website. If you have any technical issues, feel free to message Amanda, and she's labeled Oxbow Eco Center. Message her directly in the chat box for any help you need. Also, if you could take a moment and spell out your name or your video box, if you just go up into the hover over yourself, and you'll see 3 dots in the top right corner and select rename and type out your full name so we know who we're addressing. And then today for questions, we'll be using the chat box. So as we're going along, please feel free to put any comments for the speaker or any questions that you have in the chat box. And then after each speaker, we'll take 5 minutes of Q&A to ask the speaker your questions and get some answers. For our agenda today, we have a wonderful lineup of speakers. We have Mike Middlebrook talking about migrating habitats, Vincent Encomio from Florida Sea Grant talking about coastal habitat impacts of climate change. Then we'll have about a 10-minute break around 2 p.m. And then we'll come back with Jan Four from FWC talking about invasive reptiles and expanding ranges, and Dr. Tim Moore from FAU Harbor Branch talking about warming waters and algal blooms. So our first speaker today is Mike Middlebrook. He's the Assistant Director of the St. Lucie County Environmental Resources Department. He's originally from Northeast Florida, and Mike has attended school at both the University of North Florida and Florida Atlantic University, and he holds a bachelor's degree of science in biology. He has nearly 16 years of experience for managing a combined 70,000 acres of public conservation land throughout Florida. He's worked with the city of Jacksonville, Broward County, and St. Lucie County, and has led a number of state, local, and regional restoration initiatives, and has obtained nearly $45 million in outside grants and funding assistance for his programs. Mike has been an integral part of the St. Lucie County Environmental Resources Department for the past 10 years, and today he'll be presenting on migrating habitats in Florida due to climate change. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Thank you all. Thanks for putting on this webinar, and kudos to the Oxbow team and Sandy. You guys are doing an awesome job with this resiliency conversation. I hope it takes us places that we hope over the next few years. This is, like you said, Sandy, it's hard not to get excited because it is kind of, it's an evolving field. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of funding coming down the pipeline for a lot of projects that kind of, tie into a lot of the things that we're all doing. I know Vincent's going to cover a lot of the coastal stuff, and we talk about invasive species with FWC. And we do a lot of that right here locally in St. Lucie County. So I hope to talk a little bit about that, and then also cover this topic of migrating habitats. So I will give you a short disclaimer that I am not an expert on migrating habitats, but I certainly have seen a few things in the field that I thought might be interesting to the group. And talking with the folks at Oxbow when we kind of put together this topic, I found this one interesting just because it is kind of an evolving discussion. You see a lot more studies going on around in the Southeast, and not only in Florida, but in the Carolinas and the Gulf, and also worldwide. I mean, a lot of these impacts are being felt as far as Australia and a number of different places. So without further ado, I will queue up my share screen here. So, in researching some of this topic, and I realize a lot of us in the field see a lot of this day to day, so I hope to just bring a little bit of some of the photo evidence just to the forefront to kind of just get folks thinking about it when they're out there that you may not take notice to it. And a lot of the articles that I've been reading more recently, they make reference to ghost forests, particularly up in the Carolinas. A lot of them more focused on the saltwater intrusion aspects of saltwater intrusion into our water table, affecting these habitats that are nearest the coast. And a lot of these freshwater species are very sensitive and not salt tolerant. So you'll get this eventual die off along the fringes of this transition. And much like the photo here on the cover slide, you can kind of see some dieback of the tree line. And what happens is essentially the habitats can, in the past, and as with the evolution of the Earth, we would have had habitats migrating back and forth freely, adapting over time to changing conditions. And that's really what we're seeing here in Florida and then locally in St. Lucie County, is just that adaptation happens and taking place. And then I hope to key on a few little battleground areas in the swamps and such that it's most evident to us locally. But something, that you don't often consider is just with the migration of habitats and the need for the habitats to evolve and adapt like people will near the coast, we're in the way in a lot of cases. So we have a lot of great habitats further out from the coast or along our shorelines. Those habitats, we work every day with water quality benefit projects, and we're trying to provide benefits to the Indian River Lagoon. There's a lot of economic energy associated with the lagoon. That water quality is so important to us for recreational and fishing and just a lot of those things, but you don't really think holistically a lot of times in the rest of the watershed. And when those habitats are expected to adapt and migrate inland, much like people will have to at some point move away from the coast, one would think is one way to kind of mitigate for some of the concerns that we're seeing with resiliency and climate change and sea level rise. You would think these habitats would have a place to go, but what happens is they're running up against us and our urban areas. So just there's really no denying where everybody lives in the state of Florida. Certainly we live at the coast. This number changed, I'm sure, just yesterday with everybody moving to Florida since COVID, but over 15 million people live on the coast of Florida. Over 75% of our population, in fact, live at the coast. We are coastal dwellers here in Florida. So we are at the siege of what happens with climate change and sea level rise. So Florida is inevitably going to change. It always has. If you look at the history of Florida, it's been around a long time. It's seen a lot of different changes. And, not that you can't really, you can deny, and worry, and a lot of folks don't think things are happening as fast as they are, but truth be known, Florida has been submerged underwater more than 5 times throughout its history. Our geologists tell us that it's possible, right? So this has happened before. And in fact, if you look back just 20,000 years in the Florida geologic record, Florida expanded out to the continental shelf. So Florida was almost double its size it is today. So we've gradually lost shoreline in the last 20,000 years. Floridians and our tourists, we've only been about here, over the last 15,000 years or so. So when you really think about the history of the formation of Florida and it being underwater, being very dry, being underwater again, we've only been here about 0.0015% of Florida's history, humans in Florida. So I think there's a lot of drawback and you're taken aback, and it's the human nature aspect of this resiliency conversation when you think about this is how Florida always was. We don't have generational folks here in Florida that have seen what has happened in Florida throughout the years. The environment has always adapted and moved along, but now we're here. So just one of those things I wanted to call out, the fact that, you look at locally in St. Lucie County, when humans really started to change things and you can really see a significant change in our environment is in the early 1900s, up into the 1950s, when we were really starting to settle Southern Florida. We're starting to, put in our drainage features and put in our agricultural areas and starting to develop Florida and draining it essentially. So those are the things that, mostly in our department, and a lot of things when we're looking at restoration, we're looking at trying to restore, pre-1900s if possible. And I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. So St. Lucie County resembled the present day Everglades not all that long ago, within the last 100 years. In the 1950s, you can see on the left, the black and white aerial photographs. Those are the 1944 aerials of Western St. Lucie County. These are the Allapattah Flats areas It is a swamp, a freshwater swamp that virtually covered up most of St. Lucie County at one time, connecting the Everglades to the St. Johns River and into the St. Lucie River, and then, you know, touching near the Okeechobee area. And I just love to point this out because if you weren't here before 1944, you wouldn't remember what this looks like. So we've seen some significant changes here in the last 100 years, and it's a lot to contend with when we're also dealing with things like sea level rise and climate change and you know, the warming effects of climate, and then, you know, invasive species and some of the other things that we make very hard for ourselves here in South Florida. Allapattah Flats, the Allapattioka Swamp, more or less was about 40 to 60 square miles. There's been some accounts of that ran across Martin, St. Lucie, parts of Indian River up into the St. Johns River, and it virtually covered most of the land here in St. Lucie County. So we are, you know, you'd like to think about the Indian River Lagoon having a significant impact here in the local area and the savannas and all those areas of the North Fork of the St. Lucie River. But really, we got to look at the holistic of the watershed. And we tend to focus a lot in our department on the restoration of these western lands because you have a lot of you want to look at your water bodies and your freshwater wetlands as indicators. And bringing those back, since we've lost so many of them, is very, very critical to combat things like saltwater intrusion. So I tried to put a few slides together on what this might look like is to describe what habitat migration is, and really is what I mentioned earlier when we first started out. You have a suite of natural areas or natural resources, natural communities per se. This is an example down in Fort Lauderdale, but it lends itself very well to some of the natural communities here that we have in St. Lucie County. So barring the skyscrapers in Fort Lauderdale, I know we don't have a lot of those in Port St. Lucie just yet, but if you could just bear with me on this example, and I borrowed this photo from the National Park Service down in the Everglades Visitor Center. But essentially, you have your suite of habitats and natural communities. If you didn't run up against the urban environment, these communities would eventually move on their own in response to changing sea level and water events. Essentially, you would have each, you know, all those habitats labeled 1 through 9 would be able to, or 1 through 8 would be able to move inland or move out towards the coast, depending on what the ocean is doing in our sea level and climate. The concept of habitat migration that interests me the most, and the things that make me fear what we have going, is this pinch out effect. So you have expansion of urban areas even further to the coast. We have the potential of sea level rise moving inland, and then you have a loss of habitats in between. Essentially, these habitats have nowhere to run. We may be able to retreat to the western lands as we develop, but once those areas are gone, these natural communities and these biodiverse areas basically could tank out. So I'll just run through that again. Essentially, and I'm going to talk about some key indicator species that we have here, that we, you know, canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. Much would be something like the cypress trees labeled there in number 6. You know, those are usually the first freshwater species you see kind of falling apart as we have saltwater intrusion. So another good signal species that I have noticed a lot in the field, and I have some photos here going into the next few slides, is the mangroves. And what we see a lot of what's happening with mangroves is they're expanding in the range. And a lot of that in the range expansion northward into northern Florida, for instance, has been mostly attributed to you know, warmer temperatures. You're getting less frost and less freezes. And what we're seeing, though, I mean, and mangroves are very, very critical environmental natural community here, tidal swamps in southern Florida, but they're actually expanding northward into salt marsh habitats that are also equally important, if not more biodiverse, and actually displacing a lot of the salt marsh communities. So something to look at. This is just something that's happening now. I know when I grew up as a kid in northern Florida, you could not find mangroves. I mean, really the northern extent was around Daytona, maybe Crescent Beach, just a little south of St. Augustine. And today you find mangroves all the way up north of Jacksonville near Amelia Island, almost 70, 100 miles from, where they were when I was a kid. And literally the salt marshes that I grew up fishing on, you look across, you used to be able to look all the way across. Now, they're littered with mangroves. So it's just something to just keep an eye on. And there's a lot of emergence in science and studies and research going on with this. And, whether there's pros and cons to this, it's just something to keep in mind. So if those salt marshes have nowhere to expand to, and they run up against that urban area in this coastal development, we have that pinch out factor that could come along. And so you have biodiversity ramifications. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to lose, mangroves are great for resiliency and shoreline protection for human infrastructure and for storm surge. But we're also seeing this, extirpation of species and possible issues with endangered species, losing species. But I can't go any further without mentioning and giving props to the Walking Tree Brewery. I really do love Sailfish Brewery and Hop Life and the Side Door guys we have here locally. But these guys got it right. These trees truly are walking up the coast. And so just something to keep an eye on. And I have a few photos here from Broward County from my time working down there. This has also happened along the North Fork. So this is a photo of the Pond Apple area, Pond Apple Sluice. So this is a freshwater forested wetland. You have a lot of freshwater dependent species, a lot of hardwoods in here, and a lot of fringe species. But you have a lot of, what I want you to notice, it's very biodiverse. We have a lot of herbaceous cover. We have a lot of ferns. We have a lot of epiphytes. We have a lot going on. And every inch and every level of this habitat, you have a lot of diversity going on. And this even, in fact, is not probably the best representative sample because there's some hydrology impacts. This would where there'd be some standing water. So, keep that in mind. So here's a similar area. This is another area of pond apples. This, again, it would have been a freshwater transitional area, a freshwater swamp, pond apple slough, so to speak. And what's in the foreground and along the bottom, you can see things are starting to look a little less diverse, right? We're seeing a little bit of a transition happening here. And these are actually black mangrove spicules coming up amongst the pond apples. So this is kind of that defining line. This is a little battleground that's going on here. And you're starting to see that transition happen and these freshwater species and freshwater dependent species kind of falling off as the saltwater dependent species are moving in and taking kind of advantage of it. So this is just, mangroves, forests, and tidal swamps are a beautiful thing. But what I want you to notice is the diversity has changed completely. And now this is not the same area in those photos, but what we were seeing down in Broward County when I was down there, this was a lot what was happening. Essentially, over just a little bit about a time, these freshwater swamps were completely converting into these mangrove swamps. But again, is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? Not necessarily. It's a transitional thing. But the challenge is with those pond apple areas not being able to progress inland and across our urban areas, they basically, again, get pinched out of the system, and you're losing all that biodiversity that we showed in that other previous slide. Another good canary in the coal mine to take a peek at, and where we're seeing a lot of evidence, is the cypress trees. They just cannot handle any salt water whatsoever. I mean, storm events, this is saltwater intrusion, this is the transitional stuff. We're seeing, deepening of ports and our rivers and dredging happening, attributing to saltwater intrusion up our rivers and creeks and our tributaries. This also can be attributed to drought. So there's a lot of natural things at play here, but there's also some human disturbance. And what we were finding a lot in those mangrove areas too is where you would find these giant old massive cypress stumps. And so, just another evidence, another key factor of things showing of this transition happening. And a lot of us probably wouldn't notice it if you're going by it. The other photo is just a stump out in a salt marsh on the west coast of Florida. There's a lot of great studies going on in that area because they have such a different transition from the coastline on the Gulf, longer, flatter salt marsh topography, but you're finding these same similar things where you have the cypress tree stumps out in the middle of the salt marsh. So they're also seeing that transition happen. Just a few more photos of some of the things that I've seen in my time. Again, red mangroves in with pond apples. It's just, you know, kind of blows your mind. You just don't see that happening. You don't think of that when you're a natural resource manager. When you have your natural communities, this is what you're managing for. You're not really thinking about this transition happening. Pond apples, believe it or not, have done a really, really good job. They handle it really well. The saltwater changes, they really do. I mean, they hang on, they live really well, but eventually what we've found is they do succumb to things like isopods, marine isopods moving in with the saltwater and the estuarine environment. And essentially what happens is it degrades the root structure below this water surface, and you lose a lot of that root zone. Seen a lot of great old pond apples holding on, but eventually they will topple over from root rot, essentially. Most noted this in Broward County, but I'm seeing this a lot on the North Fork of the St. Lucie River and a lot of places up as far as White City Park. This is happening. And pond apples are another interesting thing. I won't go into a lot of details, but some really interesting studies and kind of just preparing for this discussion that there's some pretty good comparisons to tidal swamps and mangroves and the carbon sequestration that they provide. So there may be something that we should be looking at as far as when we try to transition habitats inland and recreate wetlands. They do seem to be a little more resilient to saltwater intrusion. So something to think about as we try to mimic freshwater wetlands further inland is to think about the pond apples versus something like the cypress trees. But another great example, red mangrove. This is a butterfly orchid on a pond apple with resurrection fern. 3 species I wouldn't expect to ever see together coming out of college and high school and working in these environments and growing up in Florida. You just wouldn't think that those 3 things would be together. This is just a quick snapshot. You could look at some of this similar to what an invasion curve looks like in an invasive species when you're seeing this kind of battleground happen. Not necessarily talking much more like the pinch out effect that I was mentioning, but really, you do get a decline in species diversity and habitat quality as this invasion happens. And so you could look at some of what's going on with the mangroves moving in, although they're probably more resilient to salt water and they're going to protect the coastlines and do a lot of good things. They do very well, just similar to things like Brazilian pepper and a lot of these other invasive species that we're out fighting every day. They do a very good job of moving in. They don't have a hard time and kind of taking over. They do really well in this transition environment. So without going too much into detail, but what's at stake? We've been kind of building the case through this discussion, but it's a loss of habitat values. You're losing those ecological services that Sandy's been really good about trying to drive this point home and this discussion and bringing resiliency forward in St. Lucie County, is trying to understand the ecological services of all our natural communities and systems that we have here and the value of each of those as they diminish or we may lose over time. It's something we really do need to talk about. We have that biodiversity declines, we have extirpation of species and habitats, we could have extinction events, and then you wind up with this homogeneous landscape phase where essentially it's just 1 or 2 or 3 prolific species, and that diversity is just kind of tanking out. And again, waterward, we're probably going to do pretty good. You're going to have your oyster reefs and your seagrasses and the mangroves doing well with this change, but eventually you could even see those pinch out as they run up against the urban areas in our man-made shorelines. So what can we do? We really just need to look holistically. I mean, this is kind of an emerging field. It's not it's emerging science. So we need to be looking at the entire watershed. And that's what we're doing here in St. Lucie County. We're really looking out beyond the rivers and beyond the lagoon and trying to come up with creative ways to mimic these habitats and recreate habitats and restore habitats. We can't just look at the coast. We need to continue to look at land acquisition and our strategies there. We need to look at management. We do got to continue to combat invasive species, undoubtedly, but we need to be looking at land acquisition. Maybe, for instance, in St. Lucie County, we went after really high quality habitat with our land acquisition bond. And there's other ideas out there that we need to be talking about. Probably we need to be looking at land that we could, essentially reclaim. Reclamation. It's not like the reclamation work going out with the Department of Interior out west somewhere. They're talking about reservation assets, our agricultural areas that may be disturbed, that can be recreated into wetlands. Those mitigation banks are really, really successful. That's a really great emerging field. We've seen that do really well, for instance, on the North Fork of the St. Lucie River with Platts Creek Mitigation Area. That was a city-county project. And essentially we recreated this beautiful freshwater marsh system along the North Fork. And that virtually was built from an old orange grove. So things we could be looking at there. We always want to look at these riparian buffers. We do a really good job in St. Lucie County in protecting our shorelines. We need to continue to improve our natural shorelines. And I love what everybody's doing. And maybe Vincent could even discuss a lot of this in his talk. And I know he has in past, but this idea of living shorelines. I love it. We need to do that so we can adapt better in these intertidal areas. We're losing those with a lot of this. And then we need to continue to fund, monitor, research, and define our habitat values. And certainly at home, we can do a lot with our native plants at home. Florida, so we're at the lowlands in South Florida with good reason. We talked a lot about Miami at the start of this discussion this afternoon. The green areas on the left, LIDAR is coming on for the rest of the state. It's a fascinating and emerging technology. It really gives you that benthic topography view shed of these areas that we're hoping to restore. And I just like to always show that area of St. Lucie County there to the right. And you can see how much lower we are from the old coastal ridge that's kind of above Lake Okeechobee and runs up the middle of Florida there. So we have a lot of room to work with in St. Lucie County, but we're pretty low and pretty flat when you look to our rivers to the east. We got I think a lot of optimism. I mean, we're not built out fully in St. Lucie County. We don't have concrete to every edge of shoreline. So, this is another LIDAR image zoomed in of the Becker Oxbow area. This is down on Selvets Road near Edwards. And it's just showing a lot of what the river looks like. We do have a lot of urban development. We do have some industrial development in these areas along the creek. But I'm optimistic that, you talk about reclaiming and restoring areas along the river. We do have a lot of room to work here, fortunately. But the time is now. We do need to be going after that. We're not making any more land. This is all we have to work with. So, and working in Broward County and working in St. Lucie County, that is one advantage that I do see here, is that we do have a lot of rural areas. We do have a lot of different areas that we could probably in turn recreate a lot of these systems to allow them to adapt and migrate. Just wanted to mention some of our work on Wesley's Island. This is a great example of things that we could do on the coast. This idea of working on the spoil islands. A lot of these are man-made islands. Wesley's Island is in the Port of Fort Pierce. This is just an area where we see a lot of room for improvement in removing invasive species on these islands and replanting these coastal systems that have been depleted, due to development. So we've seen a lot of great things happen out there, and it's been pretty easily restored once we removed a lot of the invasive species and kind of started over from scratch. And they're getting very innovative down in the Lake Worth Lagoon. Our colleagues, Eric Anderson with Palm Beach County, they're going out and creating these islands. They're recreating islands in the lagoon in these areas where you do have that coastal pinch out effect already, where the mangroves have basically moved up to the shoreline, and then we have green grass. So they're going out into the lagoon and working with them. I just hope these slides made you think. Again, I am not the forefront of this movement. I think it's a lot of room and needs a lot of studying and a lot of work going forward. But we look forward to, hopefully we make you think about what you're seeing out there watch those mangroves moving up the North Fork of the St. Lucie River. It's happening. Sure.
Our next speaker is going to be Dr. Vincent Encomio. He serves as the UF IFAS Sea Grant Program Coordinator for Martin and St. Lucie counties. He holds a PhD in marine science from the College of William and Mary at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and a master's degree in marine biology from San Francisco State University. He uses his strong marine science background to bring marine science education to our local community. His work focuses on coastal habitat restoration, living shorelines, water quality, restoration aquaculture, and community science. And today, Dr. Encomio will be presenting on the impacts of sea level rise, king tides, and coastal flooding on the Treasure Coast of Florida. So welcome, Vincent. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so that was Mike couldn't have set me up any better with regards to what he presented. And this whole idea of habitat squeeze or compaction are some of the terms I've heard. And I want to talk a little bit about, he saved a little bit for me with regards to talking about the Indian River Lagoon and the shoreline. So thanks again, Mike. And so I want to talk about some of the local impacts that related to the work I do. The previous presentation, you really looked at things on the watershed level. And I want to speak a little bit about what some of these climate impacts look like at a very sort of smaller scale, local, very localized level on our shorelines, and what it means for us as humans where we live. And Mike did a great job of explaining that. But as those habitats migrate, and that's really what I'm going to talk a little bit about, is this idea of habitat migration. They can only migrate so far because we're in the way. You know, our built environments are limit where things can migrate, where certain vegetations can move, how the intertidal zone changes, and that we're impacted if we don't have that capacity to adapt and move with that, which oftentimes we don't. We're going to suffer the impacts of that. And one of just to come back just a little bit on myself. Hold on. Let's get there. Great. So just as Natalie had mentioned, I am an extension agent for Florida Sea Grant for Martin and St. Lucie counties. And I've been working in the Treasure Coast area for a little over 10 years now. And most of my focus has been on estuarine habitat restoration, particularly the type of restoration that we call living shorelines. And I'll get into a little bit more of that as we go on. But one of the things that as I started working here and started doing work in oyster restoration and living shorelines, I was really befuddled and a bit frustrated by some of the failures we've had with certain projects. And one of the things that I started to realize as I lived here longer is the impacts that high waters had at particular times of the year. And I seem to notice just anecdotally, just by my observation, that they were getting somewhat worse and happening quite a bit more frequently for longer periods of time. So and that phenomenon, and I'll get into that in a couple slides. That phenomenon is certainly enhanced or exacerbated by sea level rise. If you were here with everybody yesterday, you might have seen this slide, but this is just sort of a basic idea of sea level rise. As the oceans are warming, you get that thermal expansion, volume expands, and the volume of our oceans expands with increasing temperature. And so as that volume expands, seas rise, coupled with the fact that as temperature increases, the melting of land ice in particular is adding to that sea level, such that you can see these changes over time. And you may have seen this yesterday as well, but just if you haven't, and I show it again if you have, just for that emphasis, that we are in a period of rising sea levels, and those rising sea levels are exacerbating or enhancing things that are normal or natural phenomenon that we experience. And it comes into play, or it manifests itself into things like this. I think this picture sort of is that that picture that's worth a thousand words, or maybe more than that. You guys have probably all heard about this. This is that octopus that was seen swimming in a parking garage in Miami. I think there were videos on YouTube about it. It's an incredible symbol of some of the impacts that we are seeing, and how climate change is affecting us directly in our built environments. You saw it very well illustrated by Mike in our natural environments, with the different types of habitats migrating, such as mangroves, for example. But this is another example. Our habitats that we've built for ourselves are now being affected as well. And these king tides are natural phenomenon. These are the what we call the perigean tides that take place when the moon is at its closest point to the Earth, and we get our higher than normal tides. This is a natural phenomenon, of course, but with more water, those tides can get higher than they would get without the impacts of climate related sea level rise. And other factors can enhance those that phenomenon as well. We tend to get these high tides, or the more extreme high tides happen in our fall, and the northern hemisphere is generally closer to the sun in both the fall and the spring. But the fall tides are a bit more extreme than the spring high tides, and part of that might be due to that thermal expansion of water as we're moving from summer into fall, where that ocean has already been warmed up and is expanding. So you have naturally higher levels of seawater during those earlier fall months. And then things like local weather and extreme storms like hurricanes, high northeast winds, hurricanes, for example. And now they're starting to understand that other larger scale phenomenon like El Nino or ocean basin type climate phenomenon like the North Atlantic oscillations not only affect the timing of when these extreme high tides might occur, but also where they might occur latitudinally, where the changes of the North Atlantic oscillation can actually cause hotspots of sea level rise that manifest themselves during these king tide events. And we've understood for a little bit now, for a few years now, that the Gulf Stream itself can have an impact on these king tide events. When the speed of the Gulf Stream weakens, the sea level can rise. You're basically allowing that water to spread out in that ocean region. And where that comes to play on a global scale is as climate changes, as sea level rise, and this global conveyor belt of how ocean water moves throughout the planet. One of the phenomenons is a longer term slowing of that Gulf Stream. So you can expect that as climate change is occurring, we will have more of these high tide or these problematic king tide events. And I want to point out that all these factors that I list above this image here are natural phenomenon. They influence these king tide events. But now with climate change and increasing sea levels, they are just being made more extreme. And this shows up here in the data of high tide flooding, showing that these events truly are increasing. And you've probably heard that phenomenon of sunny day flooding. Here's and the poster child for that is Miami, of course. It's whenever these events happen, you'll see some news stories about high tide flooding. And of course, that octopus in the parking garage was a particularly striking emblem of that phenomenon. But even here locally, this is in Martin County. Apologize, there's a few. I have a lot of examples from Martin County, and a couple, one from St. Lucie County. But this is an example of sunny day flooding in Sewell's Point, down here around Stewart. Sewell's Point's a small township surrounded by Stewart, if you don't know already. And it's a peninsula that's basically has the St. Lucie River on its western flank and the Indian River Lagoon on its eastern flank. And this is what it looked like in November of 2019. Keep in mind that this is a couple months after Hurricane Dorian. So this is not storm induced. This is strictly tidal and non-storms. And that, of course, created some problems with traffic and I'll get into a little bit more of what some of those other infrastructure impacts could be. But that same report that I showed, that graph that showed the increasing high tide flooding events or days over time. Here's a quote here: by 2100, high tide flooding will occur every other day or more often. So that's kind of crazy if you think, we think of these as sort of they're episodic right now. They happen at particular times of the year, and we're getting more of those, but they still happen at distinct times of the year. That's just crazy to think that this could actually be a nearly, certainly a weekly, if not an almost everyday occurrence. Now, coming back locally again, here's an example of a property in St. Lucie County. And this is a tidal creek that kind of comes off the North Fork of the St. Lucie. And all that scour there is, you see the mangrove on the left here. You can follow here. So they've trimmed this mangrove for the view. No issues there. But there's more mangroves further west towards the eastern side of that of the North Fork of the St. Lucie, and this creek runs into it. It's really quite nice, actually. And all that scour that you see there is not because of storms, because those mangroves actually protect them quite a bit from the wind and any storms that might be affecting the river at that time. So it's not really waves. This is all tidal here. And you can see this is kind of nice green, your nice green St. Augustine grass here with those increases of tides. And if it happens during, particularly during a drier part of the year, like the fall or mid to late fall, that the saltwater intrusion is impacting that grass. It does not like that. And you're starting to get slumping of that bank and failure of that bank. And of course, you could see how close that condominium building is to the banks of that. So these are very real world concerns. And they had asked me to come by to provide some consultation about what they can do to help with their shoreline. And that's just one example, local example of some infrastructure impacts and the sunny day flooding, where you can see this car here driving through a flooded street, and that's salt water. So you can think of what that can do to that car. And not just things like that, but what about all of our utilities that are underground, sewage, plumbing, all those things, anything that's conveying water underground or any utilities that are underground is going to impact these tidal events are going to impact all that infrastructure. And then then where it really hits home really is as we look towards the, really not too distant future. We are 2021. So if this is a projection in basically 29 years from now, so the younger people that have kids, this is when they're adults, this is when they're going to deal with this, these are the 3 states with the most homes at risk, and we're right there in the top 3, no surprise there. And other infrastructure impacts here are, you think of things like our bridges, our power plants, our nuclear power plant right on Hudson Island, for example. And then all of the things that we do to protect us from the sea, let's say the seawalls and bulkheads and all those different parts of the built environment in our coastal areas. And just to sort of hit home again, these are, this is the city of Fort Pierce, and they are well into the planning, and of course there's resiliency will continue to be an important part of their planning for this project. But this is where it really hits home for us from an economic standpoint, not just our homes and our utilities, but other types of focal points of commerce, such as ports. And we really, our general response to this are things like hardening our shorelines with seawalls, groins, bulkheads, so on and so on. About a third of all of our U.S. coastline is, if at the current rates, we estimate that a third of all of our coastline will be armored by 2100. And currently, and these are again Martin County numbers. Martin County put together a nice report on this back in 2013. So it might be a little outdated, but it gives you a good idea of where we're at with how we respond in our coastal environment to things like erosion and loss of shorelines. It's about almost nearly half of our shoreline is hardened, which is about 69 miles there. 95% of these lots are residential, and it is a frontline protection, and it does the job. But one thing to keep in mind is that these are fixed points. So once you create that structure, that's your high tide line. It's assuming that that's going to stay that way for at least as long as you live in that area. Maybe it's unrealistic to think of it as forever, but in a sense, that's kind of how it's built. Like, this is it. This is the line, and it shouldn't change. So that's one problem. The other problem is that seawalls do eventually fail, and it's a high cost to repair them or replace them. And from an ecological standpoint, you lose that habitat transition that you see in that lower picture there. You basically truncated that intertidal environment to the point where there really isn't an intertidal environment except for what's on that structure. And if it's a vertical structure, there really is not a lot of space for fauna to utilize as habitat. So this isn't a huge problem without this issue of sea level rise and coastal flooding as it relates to king tides. But of course, we're learning that you've got this fixed point, and when you get these high tides, this is what happens. You get flooding over some of these structures. This is in Fort Lauderdale. And coming back to the Treasure Coast, again, this is Martin County. This is another residential community in Martin County. And the picture on your left was a visit that I made out there in August of last year. This flooding that you see on the right, again, tidal, is in February of 2021. So that gives you a good idea of what it looks like when we do get these high tide events. And again, just to go back just a second, just to reiterate, you know, they've got this riprap shoreline, so they fixed where they want to protect that shoreline. And then of course, it's not doing its job when the tides get so high that they wash over. And just you can't really see it. I wish I had taken a better picture of it, but just off here, off the edge of the photo, are a couple of air conditioning units for that building, for a few of those residential units. And in the past, because of these tides, they've had to replace them. And that's not a huge cost when you think of it from a whole population standpoint, but I'm sure the people that lived in those units were not happy about having to do that. And we all know how much air conditioning units can cost us as individuals. And they're worried about this happening again. So they've raised those units up, but they don't have the space to move them back. So this is something they're very concerned with. Same property. And this is kind of where I hope I haven't depressed anybody too much. I'm kind of moving into the hopefully the feel-good story or feel-good part of this story. This is an area where they do have a natural shoreline where it's fairly wide. And this is a king tide event of that they had sent me a photo of back in October of 2020. And you can see their landscaped areas is all grass here, St. Augustine grass, you know, nice lush area. They've got some, you know, I think that's green buttonwood or I believe that's green buttonwood right there. So they maintain this area. This is sort of their landscaped area. And as you move out in the Indian River Lagoon, the Indian River Lagoon is out this way. It starts to become a little bit more natural. But these tides reach up quite a ways. And this is probably well over 100 yards where this high tide is reached into. And of course, it was killing their grass. But if you notice in the bottom left-hand corner, several of you that are here that know native plants can see some start of some vegetation that is naturally recruiting and native. And we started noticing that, and the photo on the right is saltgrass. So that's a native sort of high marsh, mid to high marsh species recruiting in there. And of course, it's not getting affected by the saltwater inundation from those tides. We also noticed other species as well. So we recommend the response to this, their adaptation response was simple. We just said, do nothing, stop mowing it, don't maintain it at all. And that was back in August of 2020, came back, and this is what we observed. So you can see a lot of these grasses are starting to establish there. You can see that it's less maintained. And in effect, what we're trying to do is convince them to rewild these areas that are getting inundated from these tides. Here's another example here. This is another section of this property. You can see this scour here. This is a red mangrove, actually. And there's sort of this area here where my cursor is, are where grass is dying, because this is where those tides reach up. And of course, they're concerned about this retaining wall here because there's fill right behind that. So they're concerned about the integrity of that structure as well. So again, we started seeing a few things. We saw some native vegetation like sea purslane here and there. Some new mangrove propagules sprouting up. So we said, hey, just leave this alone. And this is what it looked like several months later. If you, after I think about 4 or 5 months, and here this is grass here. So really, you're starting to see they're the adaptive capacity of this landscape, because they have the space. That's the key thing here. They have the space and the willingness to say, okay, let's leave this alone. We've got salt tolerant vegetation. It's going to hold that soil in, and it's going to be resilient towards those tidal inundations. So what I'm really getting at here is in this example is this idea of moving from sort of green nature-based infrastructures to away from these harder gray infrastructure solutions or traditional things that we do. And another example here, this is actually an old example, and this is on MacDill Air Force Base in the Tampa area. And I will say that the military is really, I think, a leader in terms of responding to sea level rise and coastal flooding, because they have so many valuable assets in coastal areas. And they're really, I think they're really ahead of the game and when it comes to this. And they're just being very pragmatic about it. And this is just one early example where the oyster reefs were built here. Spartina marsh grass was planted behind it. And then it only took a couple of years for that to grow out. And when you see that growing out, we usually define the edge of a shoreline by the furthest waterward edge of the existing vegetation. So really what we're seeing is a widening of that shoreline. And again, coming back to Martin County, this is another waterfront home where this shoreline, you can see that erosion and slumping here affected by past storms and tidal coastal flooding. And their approach was, again, to work with nature, planting native salt tolerant vegetation and a diversity of that. And luckily they were working with not only myself and my former employer, but also a very well highly skilled landscape architect who really created not only an ecologically friendly landscape or seascape, so to speak, but a very aesthetic one as well. So these are some of the plants, and we planted oyster reefs waterward of that. And it really sort of gets into this idea of utilizing what's out there, or at least recreating what you hope to be there. This whole idea of a living shoreline, and this graphic here kind of illustrates that. What we'd like to see a simulation or recreation of our natural coastal environment. And there's two situations where what was ideal is we didn't have to do a whole lot. They just had to stop mowing it. And the other situation where it was a sort of a deeper intervention involving installation of oyster reefs. And with that, I'll take any questions.
That was amazing, the solutions, and just how much nicer they actually looked with the solutions than without.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the key thing too is the willingness of those particular residents. And we're still, the story is still being written. And I have to say that one of the key pressure points or points of conflict are with mangroves and working with when it comes to waterfront homes. And we're about to enter that battle.
Yeah.
And I saw it coming. So
Right.
So really, it's like it's not just the science is there. It's really, I think it's when it comes to the built environments and people's perceptions about what they think is aesthetic, or what they think their shorelines or their coastal areas should look like. There's really the social science is that I think it's the solving that part.
So true. Diane Goldberg wanted to know, do you recommend seawalls and bulkheads or natural native protections?
We try, in my work, we're always trying to recommend a green based infrastructure solution. Sometimes that may involve a hybrid type solution where there's a sort of mix of gray and green infrastructure. And there will be some cases where the wave environment may be too extreme, or where they have to take a hardened solution. But we're not starting from there. We're starting from nature. We're starting from that nature-based solution and seeing how far we can go with that.
We're going to get started with our next speaker. Next, we have Jan Fort from FWC. She's the Non-Native Species Education and Outreach Specialist based out of West Palm Beach. She's earned her master's degree in science in conservation biology from the University of West Alabama and a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. She's a veteran zoologist, animal trainer, and behavior consultant with extensive multi-species credential in terrestrial and aquatic taxa. Her roles have focused on interactive conservation programs, developing enrichment and husbandry initiatives, and enhancing guest engagement. She's been a biologist with the Florida FWC since October 2020, working on their non-native species outreach and education initiatives. Today, she will be presenting on invasive species in Florida and their range expansions due to climate change. Welcome, Jan.
Thanks, guys. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to present to you. Like Natalie said, I am an invasive species biologist, but my role with the FWC is really, there we go, it's really education and outreach about what's going on with non-natives in Florida. Okay, so let's dive right in, shall we? We're going to talk about minimizing the impacts of invasive wildlife in our state, and I'm going to inject a lot of little tie-ins to climate change and what question marks that phenomenon raises when you're dealing with non-native and invasive species. Before we go any further, let's just go back to basics real quick. When we're dealing with non-native species in Florida, it's important to understand just the simplest definition. What's native, what's not native. So on your left, you're looking at native species. We've got a variety of animal groups, reptiles, birds, mammals. These are animals that occur naturally without the aid of any phenomenon, including humans. And so these are intrinsically valuable animals to Florida habitats, and they may be affected by the introduction of non-native species. Non-native species like the ones on the right, we've got some amphibians, fish, reptiles. These are animals that do not occur naturally, are introduced often by human activity, and have the potential to become invasive. What does that mean? When we're talking about invasive species, it means they have three impacts: either ecology, economy, or human health and safety. That's really the nuts and bolts of it. We're going to move on from there. So what kind of numbers are we talking about? Is it really that bad? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, the answer is yes. There have been over 100,000 individual observations of non-natives. So every yellow data point you see on that little map, that's an individual credible and verified, not just somebody thought they saw it. It was either verified through a photo or a biologist went out and checked on it. And that's since 1924. I want to point out that map is fish and wildlife, but does not include certain species like lionfish. If that map had lionfish on it, it'd be a lot more yellow. Now, if you break down those individual animal observations, these are all non-native species, that represents more than 500 species of fish and wildlife. Plants are an entirely separate division. So of those 500, more than 500 species, at least 139 of those are reproducing. They are established. They're able to increase their population numbers. And I want to point out, just because I love to brag on them, since the inception of the lionfish control team in 2011, over 800,000 lionfish have been removed. So control efforts can be successful. I don't want you to think that the sky is falling. But what I want to do with this map right now, if you can see the new 1985 map that just came up, this was the lionfish distribution back when I was in middle school. It's one little red dot on the Atlantic coast of Florida. Isn't that great? Now we'll fast forward. Look at this range expansion. Can you see 2020? Oh my gosh. This is a significant range expansion. Now, lionfish represent several common factors with invasive species. They can reproduce quickly and in large numbers. They don't have any natural major predators. There's nothing in our waterways that just naturally goes, I think lionfish would make a great breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm going to eat those regularly on the regular and help maintain that population. No other organism is out there as a natural predator. So these are some reasons that this fish can go invasive. No natural predators, can reproduce quickly, and big impact, lionfish consume a lot of native wildlife. So yes, the answer to the question originally asked, what are the numbers? The numbers are high. Why? How'd they get here? Well, like this mongoose that was detected down in Port Everglades from a sugar shipment from the Caribbean, some of it's just unintentional. It happens. Sometimes ships take on ballast in one oceanic location and release it in another oceanic location, transporting organisms. Sometimes cargo shipments themselves contain materials where animals can hitchhike. Maybe it's from the plants that were transported from another continent. Maybe it's in firewood shipments. There are a variety of things, but this is typically unintentional, and that introduction pathway was not planned. We do, however, have a robust live animal trade, and this is the intentional importation, and this is a big deal. We know for a fact that the most common introduction pathway is the escape or release of non-native animals. So now we're looking at an example of what happens commonly in Florida if someone is unable to keep a pet or wishes not to keep a pet anymore. Sometimes that can be due to changes in regulatory status. We'll talk about that in just a moment. They may, in the past, have released these animals. It is illegal to release any non-native species in Florida. And despite that, we have found that significant amounts of the non-native species do come from the live animal trade. Let me dial it in for you. Let's just focus on reptiles for a second. Of the known 180 introduced species in Florida, you can see from this chart that 166 or 92% came from introductions from the live animal trade. We're talking escaped or released animals. So if you add up all these taxa of animals, mammals, reptiles, fish, everything, we're talking about nearly 600 species. You can see it's 593 introduced species. 80% came from the live animal trade. So what does this mean for climate change? Hold that thought. I'm going to dial that in for you right now. Why is it that non-natives who could go invasive are a concern? Well, I'm just going to highlight a couple of factors. This list is much longer. You know from the lionfish example, some animals, non-natives introduced to our state, have few natural predators. There's nothing threatening their population or range expansion. Or it could be suitable climate adaptability. Florida has a subtropical climate. You know, different areas around the world that also have a subtropical climate. Think South America, Asia, Africa. Different parts of those parts of the world have the exact same climate. So if those species from those areas are introduced here in Florida, they have the ability to thrive. So let's put on our thinking caps for just a hot second. What happens if climate change causes the potential for decline in a native species and or simultaneously causes the potential for increase in the populations of non-native species? Okay, now this makes the entire non-native species problem a whole lot worse. So this is the question that I want to raise. This is the awareness that we want to achieve when we're talking about climate and non-native species. Here we go. Another reason, generalist diet. These animals eat a wide variety of food. So a non-native species that has a specific diet may not thrive in Florida. One that can adapt to the climate, doesn't have any predators, has a generalist diet may do very well here. They may be able to reproduce quickly or reproduce en masse, so they have high reproductive potential. And what about organisms that can survive in multiple habitats? What about their ability to disperse? Semi-aquatic organisms can go over land and water. What about volant organisms that can fly? These are animals that could have the potential to become invasive. If they do, what are their impacts? So I want to draw that parallel one more time. If we are seeing native species suffer in any way, decline of population, having threats to their population, and non-native species are thriving, their impacts could be severe. So ecological impacts include direct predation on our native species, habitat alteration. Let's tie back to Vincent and Mike's presentations. We saw a lot of habitat alteration. What if that habitat alteration that's climate-based affects the native species, allowing the non-native species to gain more of a foothold? That's the tie-in. Moving on, competition for resources. That could be competition for breeding grounds, competition for nesting grounds. It could be competition for food, just general space. And then of course, the introduction of diseases and parasites. I want to skip forward to economic impacts quickly, just because there's an example, the green iguana, which you're likely familiar with. The green iguana has the ability to have significant economic impacts because of their ability to dig burrows and damage infrastructure like roadways, water control structures, seawalls. Didn't Vincent just talk so eloquently about the need for taking care of our shoreline, and seawalls are a big part of that. If the non-native introduction is impacting those seawalls, we have more than just a non-native species problem. We have a habitat erosion problem on our shorelines. And then of course, the human health and safety impacts, bites, injury, even death in some species like a python. Let me just explain those photos. That's a tegu eating an egg. They are known to eat eggs of ground nesting birds, American alligators, gopher tortoise, and gopher tortoise hatchlings. That snake that you see has an entire native white-tailed deer in its abdomen. And that's a roseate spoonbill, which those pieces were found inside of a python. Okay, moving forward, real basic here. This is the average diet, what it would take to get a hatchling down in the Everglades to adult size, roughly 13 feet long. That would take a couple years, 5 to 7 years. Now, it's not the amount of food that you see pictured here that's the problem. It's the ability of this predator to lethally take from any of these taxonomic groups. That's significant. That's that generalist diet. So if this predator, who loves our Florida subtropical climate, can gain a foothold, then the spread can be significant, and the impact from that spread and that generalist diet can be severe. And we've seen that. That has been documented in the literature by the decline of non-native species in the Everglades. Okay, so look at the spread, just a basic map. Each data point represents a python. You can see the concentration down in South Florida. One thing to note, you see how that line of concentration starts to dissipate as you move towards Lake Okeechobee? That's the freeze line in Florida. Below that line of concentration, we don't get very many days of annual freeze down here, do we? But as you move north, the number of days of annual freeze increases. So the likelihood of pythons being able to establish further north is less. What if climate change affects that fact? That's a big if. Again, raising that question mark. Each of the other data points you see, even this little guy down here in the middle of the ocean, yes, that's real. That was a swimming python. Each of those other data points is likely an escaped or released pet who, fingers crossed, would not be able to thrive there. Okay, you saw this before. This is the invasion curve. This is what we want to think about when we're managing non-native species. Of course, we want to focus on prevention. It's the easiest. It costs the least. It doesn't require the same amount of time. That's where the FWC as an agency comes in. We can regulate the importation of non-native species. We have the authority to do that as an agency. So we want to do that at the prevention level. That way we don't have to focus on eradication and containment. However, you can see the python is now in the final stage of invasion. That is asset-based protection and long-term management, meaning we've got to look at our bird rookeries. We've got to look at critical wildlife areas and our endangered and threatened species to figure out what do we need? How can we successfully manage what has already invaded? And every single python removed is still a success story. So I'm going to go through this slide relatively quickly. I won't go through the list that you see here. We talked about some of these before. What makes a potential non-native and invasive species? Can they disperse easily? Can they reproduce quickly? Once we have analyzed those what ifs, we have a risk summary, and this is used to inform managers what's the risk level and what should they do about it. Should more research be done? Should we reach out to interagency partners? Should we do more education and public outreach? Or is it time for the rule book? Is it time to add a species to the regulatory list? So let's pause for a quick second there. We do commonly add species to that list. We have a conditional species list and a prohibited species list for non-natives. And just recently, we added several species, 16 high-risk species. High risk, based on that risk summary you just saw, were added. That went effective April 29th of this year, so just a couple of weeks ago. So multiple species were added to the prohibited species list. That's the most strict category. However, we also have written into law the Exotic Pet Amnesty Program. It's one of the things I get to manage. And this allows owners who may have kept species legally or illegally the opportunity to surrender for free with no legal penalty. So just because we have that rule book and we will use it as an agency, we also understand some owners may not want to keep their pets once they're regulated. We give them the alternative. So it's just a program I'm very proud of, and I wanted to point that out. What can you do? Reporting non-native species is a huge part of how the FWC gets its data. So you have multiple options here. There's a website, there's a smartphone app, there's a hotline, 1-888, I've got one. Credible verified reports are how we know where the animals are and if we should respond. We've had reports of somebody seeing a vine in the tree and thought it was a python. It turned out to be a vine. So a credible report is essential. So we need quality photos. We need the GPS location if possible and the date the animal was seen. Then we can go out and respond. Let's look briefly at a couple of maps to show you the expansion range of the established range, I should say, of some of the known invasive species in Florida. Burmese python is the poster child. You've heard about this species. It is established, it is invasive, it is now regulated as prohibited. But look at the range, how concentrated it is in South Florida. Again, you see those data points, those individual data points, even up in the Panhandle, there's one. And these are likely escaped or released pets. Ideally, they would not be able to survive given current climate conditions that far north. North African python, oh good, there's one with a small range. Don't we feel good about that? Yes, we do. But this is one that takes a high level of management to make sure that this range stays that small, remains that small. They are also prohibited, the Northern African python is prohibited now in Florida. Just want to look at a couple ranges of some lizards. You can see established ranges in Palm Beach and Lee counties for the Nile monitor. We are actively managing this species. This is a semi-aquatic lizard. This is an animal that can go in and out of the canals. This is an animal that can thrive. If canal banks alter, if the habitat alters, and it gives this species a leg up in gaining a foothold, this range could increase. So when we talk about climate change, we have to factor everything in. It's a web, it's all connected. The Argentine black and white tegu. I bet you're familiar with iguanas. I bet you're not as familiar with this guy. It's a very cool animal. This is the egg predator, a skilled egg predator with a high ecologic impact to any ground nesting species. That's not just birds. Alligators are ground nesting. Gopher tortoises are ground nesting. This is another animal that was just recently added to the invasive species list. And look, you can see Miami-Dade, Charlotte, Hillsborough, and St. Lucie counties all have established populations of tegus. We set traps. We're actively monitoring it. Now we're into making sure we control the spread and continue with removal efforts. This iguana, I just wanted to highlight very quickly. Notice that all the other species had a prohibited regulatory status. This one does not yet. It's on the list to watch. It's on the list to evaluate. Established in, again, multiple counties, but these populations are more disjunct. That's why you don't see that little yellow box around any highlighted counties. It's not well defined yet. And we are actively involved in needing more reports from you, the public, to help us monitor this species. Last one, just a quick fish, because I want to represent all different taxa. The bullseye snakehead, we're the only state that has an invasive population of bullseye snakehead. It's another snakehead species elsewhere, and they are common in the canals, and they are established in Broward and Palm Beach counties, and we are actively monitoring their range expansion. Again, an animal that is an air breather. How unique. This animal is very interesting when we're talking about fish species. How adaptable could it be if climate changes what's going on in its environment? Okay. Moving forward to the last couple of slides, of course, the FWC is taking action. If we're not actively doing prevention strategies like outreach and education and regulation and analysis, risk determination, then we are responding. So our goal is for EDRR, early detection and rapid response. We need a credible report. We need to list the species and say, okay, is it a high priority species for removal? Do we have a biologist we can send? And if we can do it, we're going out. And that's why we need those GPS coordinates. We need to be able to successfully locate that animal. And our response team includes not only our staff, other interagency partners, volunteers, and paid contractors. And I'm going to give a quick shout out to the Python Action Team. These are contractors with experience removing pythons that are now paid. This is a joint program between the FWC and the South Florida Water Management District. They are paid for doing surveys. Where are the pythons? Where have we been seeing them? And they're paid for every nest and every individual snake that they remove. And I just have to brag on them. How cool is it that of the 12,000 pythons killed and reported to FWC, since the start of the program in 2017, contractors removed over 6,000. Half. It's over half that the contractors have removed. So innovative success stories are essential to adaptive management of invasive species. We're wrapping it up. We have 2 or 3 more slides just to let you know how you can get involved. So you're not a contractor, but you're thinking, hey, I'm cool. I want to go out and hunt pythons. It's actually really easy to train you to do that. We have an annual competition every year. There are huge cash prizes for the participants who catch the most snakes and the longest snake. Last year, for example, we had over 750 participants representing 20 states and removing pythons for the 10-day competition. We also don't even need a competition. Last year, our executive director signed into law this order, 2017. It authorizes Joe Q. Public and Jane Q. Public to go out and lethally take invasive reptiles off of 25 managed lands. And of course, if you're on private land, all you need is landowner permission, and you can lethally remove these animals. So if you need more resources, I've got them. This is our non-native species homepage. From here, you can get all the information you need to identify and report with the iPhone app, with the hotline, with the website, whatever you need. We've also got the resources based out of that homepage to link you up to the Patrick program. That's that contractor program. We've got links to get you to the Python Patrol training program, which teaches you how to hunt for and how to remove pythons. And then, of course, we've got Florida Python Challenge if you want to put those skills to good work and go out and catch pythons and score big prizes. Remember, it's written into, codified into Florida law that it's illegal to release a species, but you have the ability to spread the word about the exotic pet amnesty program and tie it all in. We don't want these animals, even one more single animal, getting loose, either accidental escape or intentional release by the owner. So surrender it legally, safely. We will find approved adopters and we'll be able to rehome that animal to the best of our ability. If your community, your school, your whatever pet store, if you need any invasive species materials, we have those for you. I'd be happy to hook you up with some of those. And with that, I will close and take a breath and answer any questions that you might have about invasive reptiles in Florida.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was wonderful. If you guys have any questions for Jan, please put them in the chat box. And we're actually going to move on to our next presenter. But Jan, can you keep your eye on the chat box? And if any questions pop up, you can go ahead and answer them in there. Our next presenter is Dr. Tim Moore. He's a research professor at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. Dr. Moore specializes in using ocean color remote sensing technology to study the ecology of phytoplankton and the environment. Since 1991, Dr. Moore has researched ocean, coastal, and freshwater systems across the globe. His work incorporates optical modeling, remote sensing imagery, laboratory experiment fieldwork, and computer programming. He's been concentrating on inland freshwater systems over the last 10 years with a focus on the optical and ecological properties of cyanobacteria harmful algae blooms. And that's what he's going to be talking about today is algae blooms and warming waters. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Moore.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Those were all great presentations that I only got to Florida really a few years ago. So I've been working at Harbor Branch since the fall of 2019. Hearing all those presentations was really good for me to just understand more about Florida, but I'm beginning to think after that last presentation, I wonder if I'm an invasive species coming from the north. So a question to be maybe answered later, but I'm going to talk about algal blooms, both in the global oceans and here in Florida. So it's going to be mostly through remote sensing. We'll look at a lot of images, and I'll try to keep this to I'll get everybody out of here by 3. It is a Friday. But before I really dive into the imagery, phytoplankton are these single-celled organisms that live in the ocean. They're plant-like, they photosynthesize, and they're really the oldest organisms on the planet. They go back to maybe 3 billion years ago, and they were responsible really for initiating the oxygen cycle in the atmosphere. And all the life that has come on that we see today really is a result of those early days of evolution of these organisms in and producing this oxygen through photosynthesis. Today, there's about, if you were to add up all the phytoplankton in the world's oceans and lakes, there are about 1 or 2% relative to all the terrestrial trees and grasses. But because they have such a short turnover time, they only live from days to weeks. If you were to add them up over a year, they really account for about 50% of the Earth's carbon biomass. And also that means they produce about 50% of the oxygen on the planet. There's thousands of species. They range in size and also their nutrient needs and how they interact with food webs. And those are really the two critical aspects of what they do on the planet today, is they are involved with this nutrient cycling, including carbon and carbon dioxide, and they establish all the food webs in these aquatic systems. So what we're looking at now is a movie loop of satellite imagery of the phytoplankton biomass in the surface of the oceans. This is produced from many satellite images. Now the colors indicate the blues are low amounts of phytoplankton in the surface waters, and the greens are higher. And you see these patterns changing over space and time. And they respond to the environment. They're very much driven, like plants on land. They need light and nutrients. And so what you're seeing here really is the influence of that combination of nutrients and light in the response of these microscopic plants to grow. Now, what we're seeing right now is all of them together, but there's thousands of species out there. So this is another view of that. And this is actually, this is not satellite imagery, this is a model. So these colors represent different phytoplankton groups on broad levels. And they all combine to form that image loop we saw in the last slide. But what we see is they're not evenly distributed across the planet. Each one of these groups has a preference and has adapted ecological strategies to survive in these different parts of the ocean. And this is critical because this is really what sets up today's food webs. These are changing as we see this here, but these are responding to the same variations in light and nutrients. But on top of this, what we're really interested in is the long-term effect of this and how this is changing in response to these climate signals. Now, these organisms have been around since the very beginning, so they've survived many, many cycles of extreme conditions on Earth. In the early days, there was no oxygen. It was a very harsh environment. There was no ozone. These organisms helped create the ozone layer. So they have survived many, many different extreme weather conditions, and they're still, and they will going forward in the future. But how they're changing is what we're really interested in, because these are now what we know after years of studying oceans and atmospheres. They're really tightly linked to the atmosphere. We know they produced all that early oxygen. They take up carbon dioxide, so they help mitigate and control, to some extent, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what we're looking at here is just a vertical cartoon of how they are involved in this ecosystem, where they are forming this base of the food web. So they control these higher trophic layers. And they're also doing this exchange across the water surface. One of the key things that helps maintain and make them grow are nutrients. And in the open oceans, nutrients are delivered primarily through the exchange of deeper water. So that physical mixing part of the ocean is really critical to supplying nutrients to that upper layer, because they need light, so they are really restricted to an upper layer of the ocean. But climate change is impacting how those, the physical dynamics and the physical mixing is bringing nutrients to the surface. warmer temperatures are diminishing that. They're creating stronger stratified layers in the vertical of the ocean. If we look at the long-term signals that we've been getting from satellites, and I have a whole nother talk on satellite technologies and where this started and how we do satellite observations. I'm not really going to talk about that today, but satellites, primarily these types of satellites are maybe in the last 25 years have really been more routine observations for us. And so this plot on the left is showing a sequence of satellites together looking at kind of long-term signal of phytoplankton concentrations averaged in the oceans. And our concern is that the phytoplanktons are diminishing because of this global, these impacts of global change on the oceans. And we're starting to see that from these sequences of images, these long-term signals. Why is this important? Because if phytoplanktons start to change and diminish, that impacts those two things that I mentioned, both the food web structure and how the cycles between the atmosphere and the ocean can influence and modify gases that we're interested in, like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Carbon dioxide specifically in relation to climate, the global warming impact it has. And so there's this feedback loop where if we get lower amounts of phytoplankton, that's lowering their capacity to uptake carbon. Satellite images also can give us the spatial view. So that figure on the right shows, is looking at a difference now over a period of time from a set of satellite images. And the blues are where we see diminishing phytoplankton biomass, and the reds are where we're seeing higher. So like everything, there's places that get higher and lower, but the long-term average on that plot on the left shows that it's diminishing. But this is the type of information that we can get from satellite technology. How is this changing the phytoplankton communities in the water is really the key question that a lot of these agencies are trying to address their big question on, and this is funding a lot of this percolating down to many science studies and projects. But what we're seeing and what we predict from data we've collected and from models that are being developed, which are critical to understand how things might change in the future, is that we're seeing phytoplankton in general diminish, that top layer, A. We're seeing changes within the phytoplankton. So not only is the overall community getting smaller, but the relative size of phytoplankton is also getting smaller. So smaller phytoplankton are being selected over larger phytoplankton. That has a big influence on the food webs. That's really important. And we're seeing adaptations within these groups, and we're going to get into this in the next few slides as we start to look at what's going on here in Florida. We're seeing these species, these smaller species get selected. In many cases for us here in Florida that live near the coast, or we use fresh water and lakes, these negative species or these bad, harmful species are being preferentially selected as the entire community responds and adapts to environmental change. Now, this was just a recent NOAA report, actually, that came out in the last week. And this was what we're looking at. The top row is the change in temperature across the country. And the bottom two plots are the change in precipitation. The figures on the left are looking at just the change over the last 20 or 30 years. And the figures on the right are looking at the bigger change over the last 100+ years. And in the temperature plots on the top, the red colors mean it's gotten warmer. And in the precipitation figures on the bottom, the bluer colors means it's gotten wetter. So the two things that we see that really dominate at least the eastern half of the United States is that it's gotten warmer and we're getting more rainfall. And this is also happening in Florida. It's those two things, the combination of those two things are driving or contributing to this shift in ecosystems, that in freshwater ecosystems and coastal ecosystems. And they're helping to promote these other species from growing longer. In this case, we're looking at, and I'm going to focus on this species or this group of species for the next few slides. These are cyanobacteria. These are the toxic organisms that you hear a lot about from Lake Okeechobee. They're found in many freshwater systems around the world. And there's a common, in many of these systems, it's the same organism. It's the same species, Microcystis. And so you may hear that or read that in the news a lot. And these top images that we're looking at are satellite images of different blooms in different lakes. On the left is Lake Erie, in the middle is Lake Champlain, and the right is Lake Okeechobee. And these blooms of cyanobacteria are getting, they're toxic. They produce a toxin that is dangerous to humans and all animals. But the concern for this is these are naturally growing organisms. There's nothing, these have been around for over 1 billion years. So they have been around a lot longer than humans, but the combination of warming weather and increased precipitation is increasing their growing season. And so all of these organisms have preferences in terms of how they grow for their own ecological preferences and how they adapt to the environment. And this combination is favoring this type of organism. So I've already said this, they are found around the world and they're toxic, but they thrive in these warm waters in high light. And this particular organism, they float at the surface. So they can be found in these very turbid environments, which is why in Lake Okeechobee, they're being preferentially selected right now because of the lake's shallowness. It's a very turbid lake, and they can float. They have these gas vacuoles, which lets them float at the surface to get the light. So this is part of their ecological strategy, and they can tolerate high light, whereas other organisms cannot tolerate that high light. So those conditions and that strategy of floating is really favoring them. And we've seen this in Lake Erie. This is a timeline of the overall cyanobacteria populations in Lake Erie going back from the 1980s. And there's been a concerning trend that these are increasing on the increase for the last 20-25 years. Now this is, a lot of people live around Lake Erie. They use that for drinking water and a lot of recreation. So this is a big health hazard for a lot of people. And a few years ago, there was an incident where toxins, this organism got into the water plants in Toledo, and the entire city of Toledo could not drink their water for 3 days or even take a shower because of these toxins from this organism was in the water supply. That can happen anywhere. Now we're going to shift to Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee is kind of undergoing the same sort of trend. The plots on the left are these long-term trends going back into the 70s, and these are from data collected by the state. And so these are not plots you're seeing on the left are not satellite data. These are just water samples collected. But the trend is in the top plot, Lake Okeechobee has gotten more turbid over time for a variety of reasons. And the chlorophyll overall, the entire community has diminished. Part of that is because of the turbidity. The light levels the light level is too low for many of these organisms to really thrive in Lake Okeechobee, but it's preferentially selecting for this organism that can float above that. There have been attempted controls. A lot of what's driving these blooms is the nutrients. this has been, there's been a lot of nutrient control programs implemented around the country and the world to try to control these lake blooms of cyanobacteria. And that top plot on the right shows how nutrients flowing into the lake have diminished. That's that green line. That blue line, though, shows the total amount of phosphorus, the key nutrient, has been on the increase. And that's because there's a lot of phosphorus in the sediments. And as the turbidity has increased, this has brought up a lot of nutrients. They bring up a lot of nutrients with it. So this is part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that there is this global effect on these blooms. There was a mention of the El Nino La Nina cycle earlier in one of the talks. And this has an impact on this is a global phenomena. This is a natural phenomena that happens out in the Pacific Ocean. But depending on that cycle and where it is in the cycle, that can create weather conditions here in Florida that are more favorable for warmer weather and higher precipitation, and also has an impact on hurricanes, as you probably know. But this has another influence on these blooms. Well, this is a good slide to end on. We're at 3 anyway, so let's just end here, I guess. And I'll just say this, that these conditions of warming temperatures and precipitation are increasing these blooms in Lake Okeechobee and along the coast here in the Indian River Lagoon. So we saw in the oceans that phytoplankton communities are maybe diminishing, and that might have a negative effect on the climate cycle or the carbon cycle. But here in Florida, the opposite is really happening. The trend is more for things to actually, this eutrophication effect. So these phytoplankton are actually growing more intense along the coast and in fresh.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Moore. If anyone has questions for him, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. If we get a hold of him, we can ask him in a minute or so, or if not, we can email him some questions and send them out to you as well. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're so glad to have everyone come back for day 2. Had a great turnout, and we hope to be doing more presentations like this in the future. Sandy, do you want to say anything about your upcoming one?
We do have another one set for June 10th, and so we will send more information out with that one. And I think we'll work in a little bit more time for discussion and engagement, because you sure packed this one full with some fantastic presentations. Thank you, Vincent and Jan and Mike. I don't think we have Dr. Moore anymore, but fantastic information. Learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. I hope you guys have a great afternoon and a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.